This week's episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health is Let's Talk About Fear. Why fear happens and how to tackle it so you can improve your mental health and well-being. So let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello, and a very warm welcome to episode 10 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the podcast that's all about practical advice to improve and maintain your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin, and I'm very glad that you could join me again for this episode, which, as always, you can either listen to as a podcast or read on letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. This week, we're going to be talking about fear, what it is, why it happens, and how to work through your fears in order to improve your mental health and well-being. Enough of the introductions, let's get talking. Fear. It's one of the most basic survival instincts that we have. It's what helped our ancestors to know when it was time to run so that they wouldn't be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or one of the many other thousands of giant things that were trying to have them for dinner. As our lifestyles have evolved over the centuries and millennia, we've moved beyond the need to be constantly on alert in order just to survive. However, for a lot of us, that instinct, the fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'll talk about in a moment, that instinct can be overactive, or it can be hard to push through it so that we can do things that challenge us and help us to grow. And that's what we're talking about today. It's about how we get past fear so that we can live our lives to the fullest. What is fear? Broadly speaking, fear is an emotion that serves to protect us. However, it can also stand in our way because we might be too afraid of taking a risk for fear of failure or other consequences. And when that happens, it can hold us back from trying new things, which in turn means that it can hold us back from growing. The famous scientist Marie Curie once said, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood." And with that in mind, let's take a few moments to understand what's going on in our bodies when fear takes over and how it links to mental health. I'll be talking here about the more extreme biological, physical response to fear, but we'll be talking about varying different types of fear as well this episode. When we talk about the biological process of fear, it's a reaction to a threat, whether real or perceived, and it sets off a whole bunch of processes in our bodies to prepare us in case we need to react to that threat. I mentioned the fight, flight, or freeze response just before, and it's fairly self-explanatory, but basically it's the instinctive response that takes over when we're actually in danger, that causes us to either fight, run away, which is the take flight part, or freeze on the spot. And it's driven by biological responses like our system being flooded with adrenaline. These processes sharpen functions that can help us to survive, like sharpening our eyesight and increasing blood flow to our muscles. And it also slows down bodily functions that aren't critical in the moment, like our digestive system. So, if you're experiencing fear for a prolonged period of time, it actually means that your body is staying on high alert, and that can have a whole bunch of negative consequences for your physical and mental health in the long term, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Before we go any further, however, let's talk about what we're not talking about this week. When I talk about fear, I'm not talking about specific fears or phobias like claustrophobia or the fear of confined spaces, or coulrophobia, which is a fear of clowns. Just thought I'd throw that one in there. Because phobias are a much more complex topic, and I think that requires a deeper conversation. What I'm talking about is fear as an emotion that is linked closely to anxiety. In other words, the kind of fear that keeps you feeling anxious and afraid of stepping out of your safety zone. It can happen to various degrees, and for people with anxiety disorders, fear can get out of control if we let it, which can result in a downward spiral of fear, holding us back from doing things that would potentially get us out of the spiral that we're in. It's exhausting, but it can be dealt with over time. Some examples of fear might be stopping yourself from pursuing a goal or dream for fear of failure or what other people might think of you. It might be stopping yourself from having honest conversations with people in your life for fear of confrontation. It might be overthinking things and worrying about the worst possible things that might potentially happen. Or it might be being scared of something happening that is out of your control. There are lots of different ways that fear can manifest, but what they all have in common is that fear will keep you small if you let it. Because fear wants to keep you safe from harm, which is great when you're being chased by a woolly mammoth, but not so great in the 21st century when you're trying to get on with life or pursue a dream or something like that. Fear is directly related to mental health and well-being because often our fears and insecurities can make us feel anxious or depressed, and when we give in to our fears, it can create a downward spiral for our overall health. If you're experiencing the physical effects of fear, such as being constantly on edge and ready to fight, take flight, or freeze, then over time, that can have a negative effect on your physical and mental health. So aside from the obvious that I mentioned, anxiety and depression, those kind of conditions, prolonged fear also weakens your immune system, it causes gastrointestinal issues like IBS, and it can cause damage to your heart and cardiovascular system. Now, of course, I'm talking about more extreme fear here. I'm not just talking about being a little bit afraid of trying something new, but they're all different forms of fear. And what I'd like to do today is to really draw a link between the more extreme forms of fear and how everyday fear that holds us back can actually be very closely associated with that more extreme fear. Some of the other physical symptoms of prolonged fear are fatigue, memory issues, impulsive and self-destructive behavior, all the fun stuff. If that's happening, you need to go and see your doctor, no excuses. I'm going to spend the rest of the episode focused on the fear of taking risks and that type of level of fear, but bear in mind what I have just said. If you're experiencing prolonged fear and the symptoms that come with that, you need to really go and speak to a doctor, because over time, that can do real damage to your body. Now, continuing on with fear as a broad topic, fear is a good protection mechanism. Let's make no mistake about it. It's what tells us to get out of the way when a car is coming straight at us, for example. But it can also serve to overprotect us. Even if you're not dealing with the more severe type of fear that can be associated with serious anxiety or PTSD or other mental health issues, fear is still something that can constantly be in the back of your mind, trying to keep you from doing anything that might be out of your comfort zone. And if you let that type of fear win, then over time, you do yourself a lot of damage. Because if you don't take risks in life, then you don't grow, you stagnate. There is healthy and constructive fear, and there is unhealthy and destructive fear. And the challenge is to know the difference and be able to identify which is which, so that you can challenge unhealthy fears in order to grow. When it comes to fear, some of the biggest challenges in my life have been about the fear of losing something and the fear of pushing myself out of my comfort zone. Back in late 2015, I released a book about depression. It was my first nonfiction book, and I did a small speaking tour, and then I was going to go and do an expanded speaking tour in 2016. I was all booked in, but I became absolutely overwhelmed with severe anxiety and really severe anxiety, and I ended up having to pull the plug on it. Now, in hindsight, I'm well aware of the fact that I wasn't quite as cured of depression and anxiety as I thought I was at the time. And cancelling the tour actually turned out to be very fortunate because not only did I need to deal with what was still going on for myself health-wise, right at the time when I was supposed to be on tour, a good friend of mine passed away after a battle with breast cancer, and I was completely inconsolable for months on end. My point is that even though I can see the positives in what happened now, I am very well aware that the initial thing that set off a whole chain of events was fear of failure, because putting myself out there in that way tapped into a whole bunch of my insecurities. Before I made the decision to go ahead with starting the Let's Talk About Mental Health podcast, I had to think long and hard about whether or not I was willing to put myself in this position where my vulnerabilities and insecurities would all come bubbling to the surface for everyone to see. Thankfully, it worked out all right in the end, but those first couple of weeks were tough, and it really came down to pushing myself to work through my fears. So, why should you work through your fears? That's a great question, and the answer is probably going to be unique to each of us, because we have our own reasons for wanting to do things that might stretch us or challenge us. But the thing about working through your fears and taking risks in life is that by doing so, you get to achieve something that you want to achieve, and you get to shape your life to be the way that you want it to be, regardless of whether that's in some small way or some major way. Let me give you another personal example. I never learned how to drive until I was 32. I started taking lessons when I was 18, and then I was a front seat passenger in a car accident when my friend was driving. And even though we were thankfully unharmed, it really put a dent in my confidence when I then went to get back behind the wheel. So much so that I'd stopped lessons for a while. Then, not long after, I moved to the inner city of Sydney, and if you're familiar with the traffic in that city, you'll know that it's much easier just to get around by bus. And so I used that as an excuse to avoid getting my license for a very long time. And then I continued to do so when we moved to Melbourne when I was 25. But eventually, it became very clear to me that I couldn't avoid my fear for the rest of my life. And funnily enough, at the time that I was starting to think about doing something, I was managing someone who had been through similar trauma, but she had found a great driving instructor who specialised in that sort of thing for older learners, and something made me ask her for his details. I remember my first lesson so vividly, I was terrified. There's no other way to describe it. But I pushed past the fear, and I was able to do it because I had someone supportive teaching me who knew what my fear was and was able to guide me through it. So when I look at it now, I honestly don't know how I went so long without driving. And in fact, that one decision to push past my fear had flow-on effects that I could never have possibly imagined. Without my license, we would never have been able to move from the city to the country where we live now, which means that I would never have met all the wonderful people that I've met along the way, and quite frankly, I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast now either. My point is that if we let our fears hold us back, we're preventing ourselves from growing. And when we grow, we develop in ways that we could never possibly predict. Life has a funny way of taking us on completely unexpected journeys, and the challenge is to get out of our own way so that we can embrace the adventure. Confronting our fears and working through them is key to becoming what we might be. And besides, staying safe isn't a guarantee that nothing will go wrong. Helen Keller had a fantastic point when she said, "Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. The fearful are caught as often as the bold." I'm actually using quite a few quotes throughout this week's episode because when I was researching it, I was quite struck with just how many of history's greatest figures have had to challenge and overcome their fears in order to create the legacy that they have left behind. And I found picking just one or two of those quotes to be really difficult. Because the thing about fear is that everyone experiences it. Everyone, to some degree or another. The only difference between those who succeed and those who never try is whether or not you can get past your fear for long enough to see that the potential reward far outweighs the risk. And that even if it does all go to crap, then that's okay, as long as you learn from your mistakes. Getting over a fear of failure doesn't mean that you won't fail, but it does mean that you're going to give it a go anyway. As Norman Vincent Peale said, fear is never a reason for quitting, it is only an excuse. And while I'm getting carried away with quotes, here's one more quote about fear, and it's another one from Helen Keller. Fear, the best way out is through. And on that note, let's talk about how to tackle your fears. There are 5 steps to dealing with fear. Recognize, identify, confront, address, and daily action. Let me explain these 5 steps in more detail. Step 1 is recognize the fear. Sometimes we hold ourselves back from doing things without realizing that it's our fear that's responsible for our hesitation. While other times, we might be well aware that fear is in control, but we're just not sure why it's happening. We'll talk about that why bit in a minute, but the first step is to recognize that fear is happening and consider what impact it's having on us. Self-awareness is half the battle, because often we try to convince ourselves that everything is fine, when in fact, it's not. So spend some time observing what's going on and understanding what impact it's having on you. Step 2 is identify why. So once you're starting to see that fear is happening and the impact it's having on you, it's time to identify why it's happening. Yep, I'm going to be talking about digging deep again. At this point, regular listeners probably know that I'm going to talk about taking the time to dig deep so that you can really understand what's going on underneath the surface, what's really driving your fears. And you'd be correct. Because look, as I always say, When we talk about improving our mental health and well-being, our focus needs to be on identifying the root cause of our issues so that we can then confront them. Fear is an emotion, and emotions are symptoms of stuff that's going on deep down inside. It's a symptom of needs being unfulfilled, or emotional baggage from our past that's still weighing us down because we haven't confronted it and dealt with it. Identifying why could be as simple as asking yourself, why is this happening? And if you're in tune with your baggage, then you'll probably be self-aware enough to know what's really going on. But if you're not, then that's completely okay. Our minds have a cheeky habit of hiding traumatic and confronting stuff from us in order to protect us. So you might have to dig a little deeper to understand what's going on, or a lot deeper. I've talked about my favourite technique, the 5 whys, a couple of times in previous episodes, so I won't repeat it here. Feel free to listen to or read my baggage episode, which goes into a lot more detail. Or you could just Google 5 whys. My point here is to really dig deep until you understand what is really driving your fear. Don't just deal with it on the surface, really get into what's actually going on. To understand what needs to be confronted, you need to first understand what it is and why it's happening. Which brings me to step 3, confront it. Now, before you take any action to overcome your fears by addressing them head on, which we'll cover in a moment, is step 4, let's focus on step 3, which is confront it. I want you to spend a bit of time confronting your fears. In other words, confronting what they are and why they exist. This is uncomfortable stuff for a lot of people, and you might want to get some professional support while you do it. But in order to change things, you first need to be clear about what needs to change and why. Is your fear of failure responsible for you avoiding living your life? Do you walk away from relationships when things get too deep and meaningful because you have a fear of intimacy? Are self-destructive patterns emerging in your life time and time again because you have not addressed certain fears? Confront the truth, sit with it, really feel it, and acknowledge it and own it. I needed to do this when I went through quitting drinking nearly a year and a half ago, because part of my mind was rationalizing that I wasn't that bad. I only drank once or twice a week, and I didn't always get so drunk that I would make a fool of myself, so how bad was it really? But the reality is that I knew that it was taking more and more for me to feel drunk, and then once I was drunk, I would drink everything in a 10-mile radius. One of my last binges involved 3 bottles of Prosecco and almost an entire bottle of vodka all on my own. So things weren't exactly going to be getting better in a hurry. When I dug a little bit deeper, I accepted the fact that I had always relied on alcohol to give me bravery in social situations and to deal with stress. But the older I got, the more I drank. And the more I drank, the more of a hot mess I would become. In the back of my mind, I had always feared becoming an alcoholic because my father was one for many years. And I had to confront all of that to make a decision to quit once and for all. I'd quit before, but it had never lasted more than 3 months. Confronting that I had a problem and sitting with it and processing the fear around it is what made it stick for me this time. And my health has improved massively since I made that decision. So, once you've confronted it and you have a clear understanding of what the fear is all about and what impact it's having on you, it's time to move on to step 4, which is to address it. In other words, it's time to do something about it. Address your fear or fears either solo or with help, because you don't have to do things alone. But you do have to push yourself. It's up to you whether or not you're going to let your fears hold you back. If you need to change the way things are, then change the way things are. If you need more skills, get more skills. If you need more support, get more support. The only thing that's holding you back is you. Sure, there might be other obstacles that are beyond your control, but there is always a way around everything, even if that way involves going sideways or backwards for a little bit. When it comes to fear, the choice is yours. Confront it and overcome it, or let it overcome you. From there, I see the 5th and final step, although it's never really final, as being daily action. In other words, take action every day, because you don't just decide one day that you're done with the fear and be done with it. It takes constant work and effort. Take my example of quitting drinking. The first few months took a lot of work, because it was all too easy to make excuses and justify that being able to stop drinking for that long meant that I didn't really have a problem, so I could just have one glass. But because I'd sat with my fear and took the time to understand what was going on and how drinking was a manifestation of much deeper issues, I knew that I had gone well beyond the point of moderation ever being an option for me. Some people can do it, I can't. So in my example, acknowledging that I'm prone to addiction and making life decisions based on that has been one of the most important things that I've ever done for my mental health and well-being. So choose to take action every day to work on your fears, from the minor to the major. The minor might be reading an article or taking time to reflect. The major might be pushing yourself to actively do something that terrifies you. Whatever it is, take daily action that is aligned to continuing moving you forward. So let's say that you've worked through all of that, but you're still having trouble pushing past your fear. What do you do? The answer's fairly straightforward. Probably not as easy as you might like it to be, but the answer is get help. I think it's always best to try to be the one who drives your own change. After all, it's your life and it's your well-being, so you have the most to gain and therefore the greatest incentive. But there are some things that are just bigger than us. If you're dealing with deep-seated trauma from your past that's driving your fears, you cannot and you should not try to deal with that on your own. Go and see a professional immediately, if not sooner. You can deal with that stuff, but it takes time and hard work, and it needs professional support and guidance so that you don't accidentally break yourself. So if you're having trouble pushing past your fears, even in spite of all the things that we talked about in this week's episode, go and get some help. So, when it comes to fear and mental health and well-being, here are a few tips that I'd like to leave you with as I head towards the end of this week's episode. Number 1. Remember that fear is an emotional reaction that's designed to protect us, but sometimes it can do more harm than good if we let it. Number 2. Fears don't just cure themselves, they require work to process through them and confront them so that you can then address them. And number 3. Working through your fears will set you free of them because it will allow you to get past those things that have been holding you back. As always, I'm going to close out with a quote for you to reflect on. I like this quote by Marilyn French, which ties directly into this week's topic. And it is, "Fear is a question. What are you afraid of and why? Our fears are a treasure house of self-knowledge if we explore them." Let me repeat that. Fear is a question. What are you afraid of and why? Our fears are a treasure house of self-knowledge if we explore them. Alright, to summarize, fear is there to protect us, but if we let our fears control us, then we're actually doing ourselves damage in the long run. Roosevelt said it best when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and it's up to you to make the choice to challenge and overcome your fears. You can do it, and if it's important to you, then you will do it. Just remember to take things one day at a time. And that brings me to the end of this week's episode. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you got some useful advice for how to tackle this crappy stuff that we call fear. Next week, I'll be talking about the holidays. We're coming up to a time of year when things can be very challenging for some people, and there are lots of potential triggers like food and drink and family and all that stuff. So we're going to talk through how to look after your mental health and well-being and make the most of this time while you're doing that. I hope you'll join me again for that episode. Until then, stay in touch on social media. I post extra content throughout the week online, and you can find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook at LTAMH Official. That's LTAMH Official. Also, you can go to the website to find extra content, listen to past episodes, and read the written version of every episode, along with the Mental Health Talk newsletter that I send out every Friday, which is full of hints and tips for making the most of your mental health and well-being. Head over to letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. Just quickly before I go, if you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a review on your preferred podcast platform, because reviews help other people to find the show. And if you're feeling extra generous, please give Let's Talk About Mental Health a follow on Instagram and tell your friends about it. Thanks. So until next time, look after yourself and make a conscious choice to put positivity and kindness out into the world, because what you put out comes back to you. Thanks again, and talk to you next time.